everyone. For those of you who I don't have the pleasure to know, there may be none of you, but my name's Greg O'Malley. I'm a professor of history here and the current chair of the history department. And it's a great pleasure to see you all here for the annual Maya Peterson lecture. For those of you who didn't know her, Maya was a beloved professor here for about the 10 years of the 2010s before we lost her way too soon. Maya joined the department at UCSC in 2012, and I remember her being hired here very well because she was the youngest and least experienced of the finalists for our Russian history position, but she absolutely dazzled all of us with her incisive analysis, her multilingual research that took place in far-flung corners of the globe, just her poise and confidence that was clearly born of knowing her subject so intimately. There really wasn't much discussion afterwards. It was a very quick decision as the department just sort of collectively agreed that Maya was the one. And I also want to say that it's a great tribute to her that you're all here, because she was a real advocate for gathering like this. She really appreciated scholarly exchange and events that mixed the intellectual exchange of scholarship with sociability. She wanted more of this, of gathering, of talking about our work together. And so she would appreciate this, that we're here in her memory, I think. Maya earned her PhD in history at Harvard, and her research focused very much on the intersections of the environment, technology, imperialism, especially focused on the Soviet Union and Central Asia. She published articles in environmental history, in Cahiers du Monde Russe, and her book, Pipe Dreams, Water and Empire in Central Asia, was published in 2019 and was a finalist for the Central Eurasian Studies the Central Eurasian Studies Society's award for the best book in history and the humanities, so pretty broad base award. And if you didn't know Maya and her work, I just encourage you to check it out. It's inspiring stuff. She's a great writer, mixing humor with great scholarship sometimes. She's insightful and witty in her writing. And as we remember Maya, it's also my great pleasure to welcome Matthew Bender to UCSC. Matt and I, along with Kate Jones, all overlapped in the graduate program at Johns Hopkins University a few years ago, we'll say. We played on the Bygones together, which was the Hopkins in the graduate student softball league, along with Elaine Sullivan, who wasn't in our department but was at Hopkins at the time, and Kate Jones's husband, Casey Conway, was a Bygone as well. So there's some fun connections that way. But much more importantly, Matt also knew Maya Peterson through a network of scholars who are interested in the history of water and the intersection of water infrastructure and colonialism. Matt did his undergraduate work at Washington University in St. Louis and earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins in 2006. And since then, he's been a professor at the College of New Jersey. His first book was called Water Brings No Harm: Management Knowledge and the Struggle for the Waters of Kilimanjaro, published by Ohio State University Press in 2019. He's published a host of articles in the Journal of African History and other important venues. And he's currently working on a sweeping continental survey that's also under contract with Ohio State University Press that's called Colonizing Water: Empire, Commodification, and Appropriation in Africa. And we're going to be hearing, I think, a little bit about that project today. So please join me in welcoming Matt Bender.
All right, thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. Good afternoon. It is really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Greg and the members of the faculty of the Department of History for their gracious invitation. I'm especially grateful to Cindy Morris and Stephanie Hinkle for helping with the arrangements for me getting here. As mentioned, I'm professor of history at the College of New Jersey, where I teach courses in African history and environmental history. My research focuses on the control, management, and meaning of water resources, mostly since the 19th century. I'm especially grateful to be here today as I had the privilege of knowing Maya Peterson. By my recollection, we met in the summer of 2013 at a meeting of the International Water History Association in Montpellier, France, which is a great place for a conference. The IWHA, which unfortunately was a victim of the pandemic and has ceased to exist, was a small professional association with scholars from around the world working in various geographies and time periods, but who shared a passion for the historical study of water. Many of us conference regulars became close professional colleagues, or as I sometimes describe, conference friends. I saw Maya again in 2016 at a meeting of water historians held by UC Merced in Yosemite National Park, which is where this photo was taken. Here we're with a number of other water history colleagues. And then later that year, I had the privilege to see her give a guest lecture at her alma mater, Swarthmore College near Philadelphia, which is about 45 minutes away from where I live. Among my water history colleagues, Maya was deeply beloved. We knew her to be passionate and committed, and above all, just the nicest person, so kind. We still speak of her and miss her. I actually got these photos from a mutual friend of ours, Ellen, who is in the front on the left-hand side. I seem to not take pictures of people, I take pictures of things. So I had to rely on other people for help there. So the short is that I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my work with you, and in doing so, to honor her memory. So I'd like to start my talk today by taking you to the city of Cape Town, South Africa. So Cape Town is one of Africa's most iconic and modern cities. It has a population of nearly 5 million, wedged between the Atlantic Ocean and Table Mountain, which is the feature in the back. It is often considered to be one of the world's most beautiful cities, along the lines of Rio de Janeiro and Vancouver. Yet back in 2018, the city nearly ran out of water. 3 years of persistent drought had left its 6 reservoirs nearly empty. City planners predicted that by April of that year, the reservoirs would drop to the point where they would have to turn off the piped water system entirely, forcing nearly 75% of the population to line up at collection centers to receive daily rations of 25 liters per day. The forecasted day when the taps would be turned off came to be known as the foreboding Day Zero. The crisis evoked reactions that in many ways reflected the political, economic, and racial divisions of South African society. It also generated a tremendous public response, driven in part by mandate, price hikes, peer pressure, and feeling of civic responsibility. Cape Townians embarked on a massive effort to reduce water consumption. People gave up baths in favor of 5-minute showers, conserved refuse water for other purposes, and abandoned washing cars and irrigating lawns. Some built rain catchment systems and sunk new boreholes to reduce reliance on the public system, while the city explored technical solutions such as desalination. Large farms outside the city, who are actually the biggest volume consumers of water, promised to divert water into the city supply. These initiatives cut the city's daily consumption from 1.2 billion liters per day to 540 million liters, helping to push back Day Zero. 4 months later, in the midst of South Africa's winter months, the rains returned. And as water poured into the thirsty reservoirs, the crisis became averted. To some observers, Day Zero never came. The prospect of Cape Town becoming the first major world city to run out of water generated tremendous global attention. Media outlets capitalized on the dystopian nature of a Day Zero. Common themes emerged in the coverage, emphasis on the catastrophic and unthinkable nature of the event, the response of everyday people to the hardships, and above all, perhaps the likelihood that other cities would soon experience their own Day Zeros. Less attention focused on what factors led to the crisis, aside from coverage of global climate change. Even less focused on the deeper history of Cape Town's waters, and almost none situated Cape Town within an African context. Cape Town was a developed city rather than an African one, in Africa but not of it. Others posed more complex and nuanced narratives. For example, an article in GeoForum focused on the deep inequality between the city's wealthy, largely white communities and the poorest areas where most people of color lived. I've got these great juxtaposed photos here. This is people queuing up for water in a predominantly white neighborhood with big jerry cans. The article asked to what extent Day Zero was a water crisis of affluent Capetonians, noting that many people in the city's townships and informal communities had long lacked access to reliable water. Another article in the International Journal of Disaster Risk identified Day Zero as a quote, purposefully designed narrative in political communication to change middle-class water consumption behavior, end quote, that also, quote, triggered protests against an underlying everyday crisis of water penury for marginalized urbanites, end quote. So articles like this began to focus more attention on the connection between water scarcity, urban inequality, and the history of the city. Disparities in access to water in Cape Town generally run along racial lines that were established during South Africa's colonial and apartheid eras. For a large proportion of Cape Town's poor citizens, whose only formal access to water is a communal tap such as this one, Day Zero is actually a constant reality. In the eyes of these observers, the Cape Town water crisis didn't just happen. Rather, it was produced by historical circumstances dating back centuries, ones rooted in the continent's colonial history. These struggles of the majority of Capetonians are juxtaposed by wealthier Capetonians who had no choice but to become more conscientious about their own water consumption behaviors. In other words, they were forced to become more resilient in ways that were long established in the city's townships and informal settlements. Rather than an anomaly then, Cape Town mirrored much of the rest of the continent. The city reflected not only Africa's challenges of water scarcity, but also its resourcefulness or potential resourcefulness in adapting to it. So what I present to you today is an overview of a book manuscript in progress. It examines the history of water resources in Africa with an eye to understanding the origins of Africa's ongoing crisis with water scarcity. It tells two stories. One is the story of how European colonialism transformed how these resources have been controlled, managed, used, and conceptualized. The other story is how African societies responded, often in ways showing tremendous resiliency. What I argue in the book is that European rule effectively colonized water in ways that have had lingering impacts. The ways in which this happened not only help to explain present-day water supply issues, but also this resiliency that is a defining characteristic of many African cities. So first, let's get a grasp of Africa's waters and the nature of its water crisis. The continent is the second largest, the second most heavily populated, and the fastest growing in terms of population. While it does have notable surface water resources, such as the Nile and the Niger rivers, Lake Victoria, and the tropical rainforests of the Congo, these resources are unevenly distributed and inefficiently harnessed. As of 2021, nearly 400 million people in sub-Saharan Africa lacked access to basic drinking water, which is defined as an improved source with a collection time of not more than 30 minutes. The crisis is particularly acute in the continent's fastest growing cities. According to World Resources Institute, cities in sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest proportion of piped water to a yard or dwelling. Those without piped water often rely on alternative providers, such as private vendors, whose cost can be as much as 52 times the cost of piped water. For those who do have piped water to their homes, surface is often intermittent and subject to contamination. A paradox, therefore, exists in that the continent actually does have enough water, but due to uneven distribution, poor governance, and infrastructure, clean water doesn't get to enough people in enough quantity at a good enough price. This is what scholars often refer to as economic water scarcity versus physical scarcity. And you can see on the map the areas in the blue have surplus water. They also don't neatly align with population centers. A key argument of my book is that the current plague of economic water scarcity is in large part a legacy of the colonial era. Though the continent has engaged with Europeans for centuries and along its coastlines since the 15th, its history of colonial engagement is largely a story of the 19th and 20th centuries. The main exception to this is actually the Cape Colony, home of Cape Town, which has a colonial history dating back to the 17th century. For most Africans, though, the era of European colonial control began with the scramble. Oops. Oh, my phone is pressing on the, there we go. Okay. So what I would like to emphasize is that water influenced from the earliest moments the ways in which the scramble unfolded. Coastlines provided access while rivers served as corridors and later defined borders. By the start of World War I, nearly 80% of the continent had been colonized by European nations. The bulk of African territories have been claimed by the British and the French, while Belgium, Portugal, Germany, Italy, and Spain held smaller possessions. The establishment of former colonies led to a host of political, economic, and social transformations that deeply affected the lives of Africans. So I propose that while Europeans colonized nearly the whole of the continent and its peoples, they at the same time effectively colonized water. This beckons the question, what does it mean to colonize a resource? Isn't it enough to say that water was colonized as a byproduct of the colonial process? To do so, however, I think obscures the deliberate ways that colonial policies and practices transformed the resource. So let's start with defining the term colonialism. There's no shortage of definitions for this term. For our purposes, colonialism refers to the process whereby which Europeans established domination over African societies. This was a holistic endeavor involving nearly every aspect of life for Africans. As noted by Amber Murray, this involved a combination of territorial, juridical, cultural, linguistic, political, mental, epistemic, and economic domination. These forms of domination worked to establish and maintain a clear social hierarchy between colonizers and the colonized, and to facilitate exploitation of human and natural resources. Water was a central part of the objectives of colonizers in a myriad of ways. Deep water ports and rivers provided a means to move goods. Surface water could be exploited for irrigating cash crops. Both surface and groundwater could be harnessed for cities and industry. Control of these resources meant control of the colony. Furthermore, water carried a host of cultural and spiritual meanings to Africans. Challenging these ideas, therefore, could facilitate the alleged so-called civilizing objectives of colonial rule. In drawing on this line of thinking, my book argues that European colonial regimes directly and deliberately colonized African waters as a means of asserting control of their productive power and taking it away from Africans. Taking control of African waters was not incidental to colonialism, but was central to facilitating it. This involved seizing control of water, introducing new ideas about management, all the while challenging existing notions and practices and promoting new ways of thinking. So to make this all a bit more manageable, my book focuses on 5 ways in which Europeans attempted to colonize Africa's waters. Mapping and staking of territorial claims, the development of laws, treaties, and regulations, commodification, new forms of water knowledge, and development projects. So this book is a bit of an odd duck. I'm going to make lots of water puns, so just get used to it. I'm also really nervous because I really care about this. I feel like I'm representing all the water geeks who love Maya. So this book is meant to be an introduction to the topic. It's not meant for specialists. It's meant to be broad in scope. So I will probably touch briefly on things that you would like to know a whole lot more about. I'm happy to provide more detail as we move forward. All right, so how did water get colonized? Let's start with mapping and staking territorial claims. So the first way that Europeans colonized African waters was by mapping the coast and staking claim to land. Most of us may remember the famous Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, the person who in 1497 discovered the first sea route from Europe to India via the Cape of Good Hope. What you may not know is that he was preceded by decades of other mariners who charted and mapped Africa's Atlantic coastal lines. Mariners such as da Gama, Bartolome Diaz, and Diogo Gao, I'm working on that, helped to facilitate our first maps of Africa. So the Africa as we know it was largely a product of these marine expeditions. They also left behind pedraos, which is this here. These are large markers that were meant to stake claims to territory, and they line the African and Indian Ocean littorals of the continent. This one here is from Malindi in Kenya. It's the only original one still standing. So these represented the first territorial claims made by Europeans in Africa. Over several decades, other European states followed, namely the Dutch, the British, and the French. Coastlines became the birthplace of European engagements with Africa. For the first 3 centuries or so, European engagement with Africa remained largely limited to coastlines, with the trade of enslaved persons as the largest form of commerce. In the era of the scramble, European involvement expanded beyond the coast into the interior. Yet, in this era as well, these actions were shaped by water. Rivers served as pathways into the interior, while water features such as lakes, the source of the Nile, and the snows of Kilimanjaro provided destinations. Water features were not only pathways and destinations, but also came to define competing claims. The Zambezi River, for example, defined the boundary between British and Portuguese claims in Southeast Africa. The Niger River linked together numerous French claims before passing into British territory. On colonial maps, many boundaries came to be defined by rivers and lakes. For the most part, though, the ways in which Europeans mapped water features and used them to stake territorial claims were very foreign to Africans. The societies that now found themselves incorporated, often by violence, into European colonies had long held their own notions of space and defined their own boundaries according to dividing lines that made sense to them. In general, African notions of space have historically been way more fluid than European ones. And that's another water pun. Yet European maps and notions of space fundamentally reshaped the continent after the 1880s. So the second are development of laws, treaties, and regulations. A second way that European countries colonized was through the development of laws, treaties, and regulations. Europeans introduced a host of new legal tools meant to take control of African waters. These fall into a number of categories, but some of the most important were treaties with African political leaders, watershed treaties, and countrywide water laws. Treaties with African leaders were some of the earliest ones. These were meant to secure European claims for water alongside claims to sovereignty over African territory. These treaties and the deception that underlay them were often used to trick Africans out of their own land. There's no shortage of scholarship about the way in which these sorts of treaties worked. They've been well studied, but not from the angle of water. It's important to note that the treaties often specified specific water rights, indicating the importance of those resources to colonizers. One example from my sort of research home of Kilimanjaro is the Treaty of Protectorate of Mochi, which was a treaty signed between the Sultan Mandara, who was one of 40 or so mountainside chiefs in the 1880s, and Karl Juke of the German East Africa Company. This took place in 1882. So the treaty has 2 parts, the first of which is a statement of friendship, and the second of which says you give everything to the Germans. And one of the things that I want to point out is that in the second part of the treaty, the control of water resources is very specifically described alongside land. Now, watershed treaties were international agreements, usually between European colonial powers. These divided up the waters of the continent and set borders for territorial claims. They specified which colonial territory had right to which waters at what times. Perhaps the most famous of those are the ones that have divided up the Nile River watershed. So this is a map of the Nile watershed. The Nile has 2 headwaters, one in Ethiopia and one, I think, in Uganda. There's some debate about that. The Rwandans say it actually isn't Lake Victoria, but that's for another topic for another day. So, of the nearly dozen colonial era treaties that divide up the Nile, the most important was the 1929 Nile River Treaty. This granted Egypt the vast majority of the river's water flow, while also giving the country veto power on any upstream water project. Of note, it denied any specific water rights to Ethiopia, the one country in the watershed that wasn't actually colonized. In effect, it gave Egypt dominion over the Nile River, though it was the most downstream country in the watershed and contributes very little to the river's water flow. At the level of individual territories, colonial powers developed a myriad of laws and regulations to control water, based on their own legal traditions. These determined who could use what water and in what quantities. Many colonies had a master water law, which vested control of all waters in the hands of the state. If someone wanted to access water, they needed to secure a right from the government, a process that involved paperwork, surveying, and often the payment of fees. The first colonial water laws, as might be expected, were developed in the Dutch Cape Colony. Shortly after establishing the colony, Jan van Riebeeck issued a series of proclamations to control the waters of the Table Bay Valley. These were based in Roman Dutch law and reflected the civil law principle that the state owned all public waters. The earliest proclamations focused on controlling water use for hygienic reasons to keep upstream users from dirtying water for downstream users. But soon, the focus shift to dividing up waters among irrigation, livestock watering, and domestic purposes. For the parts of Africa colonized during the scramble, the body of laws and precedents from the colonizing country constituted the basis of water law. British colonies assumed the principle of riparianism, while other territories made distinctions between public and private law according to civil codes. By the 1890s, colonial governments began developing their own water laws and regulations, largely once they realized that these countries were hydrologically very different than the metropole. In southern Rhodesia, for example, a series of ordinances in the 1890s specified the water requirements of towns, while a 1903 ordinance regulated the control of water in mining districts. In Ghana, the 1903 Rivers Ordinance made it unlawful to divert water from any river for purposes of irrigation, mining, industry, or power generation without a government-issued license. It also gave the government the right to license steam vessels and to regulate dredging and fishing. By the 1920s, nearly every colony had developed laws and regulations related to water. These related to a host of issues, from providing water for urban supplies, commercial agriculture, mining, as well as protecting forest watersheds and fishing rights. So for everyday Africans, these laws and treaties had impacts in their daily lives. They vested control of water in the hands of the state, and therefore reduced local autonomy. And access came to depend upon an often labyrinthine process of applying for permission to use waters which were hard to navigate and very expensive to do so. They also created something which had been up to that point pretty unprecedented, the notion that water use could be illegal. The third is commodification. And I took out some material on measurement. I'm very fascinated with measurement. This all requires measuring things in different ways, and it's a side project I'll get to at some point. So a third aspect of colonization of water involved commodification, or transforming water into an economic good with a price that people had to pay for. In much of Africa's history, water could best be described as a relational good. Access to it depended upon relationships. It had value. People certainly needed it for drinking and brewing and everyday tasks and for irrigation. But it rarely had a price or was subject of buying or selling. European colonial rule introduced substantive ideas or changes to how people thought about the value of water. Colonial water laws were predicated on the notion that water had economic value and was inherently scarce. At the heart was an assertion that the state ultimately controlled all water. By requiring Africans to pay for it through rights, permits, and fees, colonizers were, in their minds, providing order to a world they envisioned as unorganized and inefficient. Fees also had a practical end. They helped to fund construction projects and maintenance of waterworks, and the salaries of people who worked on water boards and district water commissions and irrigation officers. Perhaps more importantly, though, state officials viewed water as a scarce resource in the context of the empire. African colonies had few water systems that they deemed to be modern or improved, and compared with Europe, much of colonial Africa was semi-arid. Commodification, therefore, provided a mechanism for controlling a scarce resource. In other words, preventing users, in particular Africans, from using water in ways that they deemed to be wasteful. Another important aspect of commodification is that in ascribing price to water, colonizers created a mechanism for prioritizing the uses of the state considered to be of greater economic value. By tying access to ability to pay, users with greater resources could gain access to water at the expense of others. A good example of the impact of commodification was the development of urban water systems. In the first decades of the century, colonial regimes constructed pipeline systems to provide towns and cities with tap water. Freetown, Sierra Leone was among the first to get it in 1872. Conakry in Guinea followed in 1903, along with Lagos in Nigeria in 1910, Mombasa in Kenya in 1918, Dar es Salaam in the Tanganyika territory in 1919. This is an urban map of Dar es Salaam. To get access to water from a piped system, users had to pay fees, which could be assessed based on a flat rate or volumetric rate by usage. Commoditized water was, in theory, fair to everyone. Pricing provided a way to ensure that people only used what they needed. However, the reality was that piped water and commodification in general embedded deep inequalities between the colonial haves and have-nots. In urban areas, European residential districts received the best services, followed by commercial districts and Asian users. African formal communities received substantially poorer services, on the whole, followed only by informal settlements whose lack of formal recognition meant they received virtually nothing. The stark inequity can be seen in Dar es Salaam, where if you notice on the map, there are Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. 1 refers to the area zoned for Europeans, 2 to the commercial district, an area for Asian populations, and 3 was the area formally designated for Black settlement. District 1 and 2 received 80% of the pipe network up until the 1960s, leaving only 20% of the network capacity for Zone 3, yet Zone 3 had 80% of the whole population. To give you a sense of this stark inequality, water planners calculated that African users didn't actually need all that much water, 3 to 4 liters per day, compared to 34 to 65 for Asian users and 140 to 195 for European users. So the inequities built into these systems they happen on multiple levels, where water is provided and the expected need of the communities, which determines the gauge of the pipes. Next is new ways of thinking about water, which I admit is a very broad name, but it encompasses a lot of things here. So this is a diverse range of ideas, practices, and beliefs that ranges from religious beliefs and practices to notions about science, sanitation, and disease causation. European societies had, of course, African societies had long developed deep knowledge about water. Water figured heavily into African spiritual beliefs and notions of origin. It's really difficult to generalize the range of forms of religious expression across the continent, but there are a number of patterns. One is that pre-Christian and pre-Islamic religious systems in Africa tended to think of religion as local. Each community had their own deities, distinct from those of other communities. In many communities, water was considered a gift from a creator god, or could be influenced through the actions of spirits, deities, and ancestors. Another common attribute is that harms to people or communities tended to be viewed as the result of actions by malevolent ones. Meanwhile, the vast number of Muslims on the continent and the smaller number of Christians likewise held water to be of tremendous spiritual significance. European colonialism introduced several new bodies of knowledge that challenged existing thoughts about water. Some of these related to religion. So missionaries flooded to the continent as part of colonization, bringing new and Christianized ideas of water with them. For missionaries, existing thought about water reinforced so-called pagan notions of spirituality that they viewed as an obstacle to spreading their faith. As such, they introduced competing notions of spiritual origin, power, and the significance of water. A good example is the work of missionaries on Mount Kilimanjaro. Catholic missionaries from the French Spiritan order introduced the idea that water was a gift from the Christian god, not the local god Rua. They pushed back against the idea that local divinities could influence rainfall patterns or cause crops to fail. In place of ancestor worship, they encouraged people to pray to God to make it to rain or to make it to stop. During periods of drought, they encouraged people to come to churches to pray, holding novenas and praying of the rosary, rather than making offerings to spirits. And what I think is one of the most sort of fascinating things, they even rejected the idea of naming irrigation canals after your ancestors. So when the Catholic mission in southeast Kilimanjaro built its own irrigation canal, it named it Mtakatifu, which is the local word for Holy Spirit. Another body of knowledge introduced through colonialism was Western science. Colonial officials often extolled their water management and practices through a language of science and modernity, comparing it with so-called primitive and backward practices. Good examples include how medical practitioners and midwives introduced practices such as boiling of water and the use of pit latrines to stop waterborne disease, as well as more frequent bathing. Often, these kinds of ideas were disseminated in schoolhouses, in areas like Kilimanjaro, in places where the more urbanized communities, school attendance became a symbol of status for middle-class African families. And so in sending their kids to school, the kids would be taught things that the missionaries and the teachers wanted them to carry back into their homes. So as educational systems expanded, they created a mechanism whereby which children were vessels for bringing ideas. Also, children would often be punished if they came to school unbathed or their clothes weren't washed. So it had a coercive influence on domestic water. Now, one of the most interesting things about these kinds of things is that these often took place in the most intimate, or some of the most intimate influences of colonial rule because they happened within homes. They were also the forms of influence most likely to involve women as the managers of homes and the managers of the home-based water supply. They also tended to be the area in which Africans had the greatest ability to selectively incorporate or reject ideas because it was within the confines of the home and outside of the public sphere. So the fifth one is development projects, which is people like infrastructure projects. So I admit I had a lot of fun writing this chapter. So lastly, one of the most visible ways that Europeans colonized water was through the development of waterworks projects such as dams, canals, and irrigation systems. These were some of the most visible manifestations of colonial power over water. These projects attempted to harness the power of water for colonial purposes. These varied widely and over time. For the first half of the 20th century, irrigation and domestic water provision were among the most common projects associated with water, along with ports. After World War II, hydropower emerged as the focus of even larger scale projects. This is an era where James Scott and others have talked about high modernism. Certainly you see this idea that technology has the power to save in the 1950s and influences these massive scale projects. Indeed, while much of the world has turned away from large dam construction, dams were and continue to be relatively embraced by the global south. And there's a couple of really large-scale dams that have recently been finished in China and sub-Saharan Africa. So there are numerous examples of projects. Perhaps one of the most important and the earliest was the Suez Canal, which not only provided a shorter sea route between Europe and the Indian Ocean, but was also central to the British conquest of Egypt and consequently much of the Nile River Valley. Another prominent project, which is in the picture here, was the first of the two Aswan dams. This is the Aswan Low Dam. If you ever go to Egypt, both dams are there. They are about a quarter of a mile apart from one another. I thought that one would not be there anymore, but they're both there, the low and the high. So this dam was built between 1899 and 1902. It stretched across the Nile River, impounding water for the purposes of irrigation development. The project was, at the time of its completion, the most ambitious water engineering project that the world had seen. Yet it also shows how colonial actors in building projects often considered a narrow range of interests when designing them. While the dam did enable some irrigation expansion in the Nile River Valley, it fundamentally altered the hydrology of the downstream watershed. It ended the seasonal flooding patterns that had for millennia given Egypt its agricultural vitality. In essence, it actually created a new form of dependency, even as it promised to give more opportunities. An even more egregious project was, an even more egregious project was the Cahora Bassa, which was a dam built in colonial Mozambique. This project was proposed in 1965 as a $500 million project to dam the Zambezi River with the goal of producing hydropower. In the words of Overseas Minister Dr. Silva Cunha, Cahora Bassa would, quote, tame the wild river and transform it into a valuable tool for progress, end quote. Yet, the administration in Lisbon lacked the financing to pay for the project, and they didn't have anybody to consume all the electricity that would be produced. So 4 years later, they entered into an agreement with South Africa, which was then governed under the system of apartheid. And so when the project came to completion in 1974, it was primarily for the benefit of apartheid South Africa, with all of the negative impacts being felt by locals within the community. So these projects, perhaps more than any other aspect of the colonization of water, exploited local communities in favor of colonial actors. Dams and reservoir projects flooded land, requiring resettlement of vast populations, often through the use of force. They often resulted in negative effects for the remaining locals, such as spikes in waterborne illness and malaria. The benefits that materialized often went to far away areas, such as cities, industries, and even other countries. But more often than that, the full benefits to the colonial state often never materialized. So they often ended up as expensive boondoggles, where the negative effects were felt most acutely by the people living in their shadows. So overall, quickly, a summary of what happened here. So these 5 examples of how water was colonized, I think, provide a framework for understanding the vast ways in which colonialism transformed the control, management, and meaning of water. In some, they centralized control of water in the hands of the state at the expense of local communities. Projects were often ill-advised and poorly conceived, expensive, and failed to work as predicted. Few envisioned the needs of everyday users and rather prioritized the interests of the state and its preferred actors, and often left local people with few options. But despite that, what we see is that people responded with a tremendous amount of resilience, that despite the fact that colonial water was often not meant to cater to their needs, people found a way to work with the system. And one is that people often became astute at leveraging gaps in colonial laws. So for example, the city of Benin City, Nigeria in the 1930s, a community of users came together and petitioned the government because they said that the rate that they paid for water was too high. And this goes back and forth for 3 years where they construct an argument about the pricing structure being unfair. So they embraced the importance of piped water in an urban setting, but said that the rate was completely unfair to what users in other places were paying. So they managed to find a way within the system to push back against its limitations. Another example from my home of Kilimanjaro, where local farmers had a 400-year tradition of building irrigation systems before the British ever showed up. Farmers became quite good at thwarting regulations requiring them to register new irrigation canals by building new ones and then claiming that they had actually been there but had fallen into disrepair and were merely being resurrected. And that was a loophole in what they call native law and custom, or the colonial law specifically designated for African areas. So by doing that, it became very difficult for the colonial state to prove that a canal was actually new, which made enforcement of the permitting regulations often pretty challenging. In cities such as Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, Dakar, people who lived in underserved areas often adapted by constructing their own works on their own, so shallow wells. But the big thing that develops is a private water market. And today, this is one of the main ways in which people in underdeveloped cities in the global south get water, which is that they buy it from vendors. So today, it's quite common for people to go to a store or to see a person who was coming by on a trolley and to buy a jerry can full of water for drinking or cooking purposes. Though this is high cost, it's extremely high cost compared to tap water, the quality is often questionable, and the nature of it inherently limits the volume that people can consume. This has become a mechanism whereby which people have managed to make urban areas livable. It happens in wide scale in virtually every city in the global south. Cultural. I get to show this great picture. So this is a figure whose name is Mami Wata. So Mami Wata is a water spirit. And the story of Mami Wata is that the concept originates in West Africa in the 15th century. So Mami Wata was known to be a spirit who could take the form of a mermaid and sometimes a snake charmer, who could was associated with wealth, fertility, healing, wisdom, and beauty. Very likely it's a person that originates through pre-colonial forms of religious expression such as Vodun in West Africa. So it's very popular today. For the figure of Mami Wata has become a kind of continent-wide phenomenon. So across the continent, people know this character. In Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, we see images of a woman mermaid spirit. And beyond that, reverence for and belief in the spirit persists at the same time as acknowledgement of both modern science and Christianity and Islam. So despite the fact that this would be a character that many of the early colonial missionaries would have thought to be something that they would want to combat, the figure continues to have deep resonance in people's lives. It's also it's very important not to underestimate the importance of resilience. So resilience has fueled the development of Africa's largest cities. They have grown despite the lack of reliable services. Despite that, they create a world in which people lost control of resources they had long utilized. Water was effectively removed from the locality. And though water resources were ostensibly being developed, this was not on behalf of the masses. And therefore, it embedded systemic inequity that would prove difficult to overcome. Which raises the question of what happened with independence. Did the end of European colonialism lead to a decolonization of water, like it led to a decolonization of political systems or economies or anything else? Early independence leaders certainly thought so. Prominent heads of state like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire all extolled the centrality of water to their development plans and ideas for nation building. However, the reality is that in the independence period, planning very much mirrored that of the colonial states. Water remained very much under the auspices of the central government. But rather than Europeans being in charge, it was the former nationalist leaders who now held the reins of power. Water policy was still very much controlled by elites rather than everyday people. And the benefits of large-scale projects tended to be for the few rather than the masses. Local communities often bore the brunt of planning that all too often ignored their needs and interests. So what we see is, rather than a fundamental change in the way that water is developed, a repetition of colonial era policies. The best example of that is probably this. This is the Akasambo Dam in Ghana. So the Akasambo impounds the world's largest reservoir by surface area and the third largest by volume of water. It was conceived during the colonial period, but it wasn't brought to fruition until the government of Kwame Nkrumah during the independence period. And the idea behind the dam was to generate electricity to jumpstart an aluminum smelting industry. So the dam was constructed, it's still there, it impounds lots of water. The aluminum industry never developed as planned. And so it functions at a fraction of the capacity that was originally planned. Furthermore, there are loads of spillover effects. We have upstream waterborne diseases that are rampant in the reservoir. And because the dam wasn't built with sufficient capacity, they periodically have to release excess water to keep the dam from breaking, which floods downstream areas. Plus, there were 40,000 people who were forcibly removed out of the reservoir area to build this thing. And this all happened in the independence period, when development was ostensibly being done on the behalf of the masses. And I could do dozens of projects like this that are very similar. Now, by the 1980s, many of these ill-advised projects were caught up in the broader economic challenges of African states, which became acute in the 1970s and early 80s. And that led to intervention by organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And that led to focus on the water sector, in particular the idea that privatization could be a solution, or that making people pay for water could be a solution. Neither one of those effectively addressed these sort of underlying inequalities, and they actually, for everyday people, made their lives even harder. Loads of examples of disastrous privatization strategies that were meant to provide some way to better serve people. So what are the implications? Well, the result is that today is a continent that faces a water supply crisis. The problem looks to get worse. As of 2020, the population of sub-Saharan Africa was growing at a rate of 2.7% per year. That's more than twice that of South Asia and Latin America. 21 of the world's 30 fastest growing cities are in Africa. Population growth and urbanization have the potential to exacerbate already existing water supply challenges. Then you add on to that the looming problem of global climate change. In North Africa, climate change is likely to lead to declining rainfalls. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's likely to worsen precipitation extremes, so more flooding and more drought. Rising sea levels then contribute to the problem of saltwater intrusion on coastal aquifers, which are already under threat from over-extraction. So these pose a threat not only to drinking water, but also to agriculture. And most Africans depend on rain-fed agriculture for their food supplies, so problems with drought and scarcity likewise echo over to the food supply. So if the current water crisis in Africa is a result of water not being fully decolonized, then how do we decolonize it? Well, here I fully acknowledge my limits as a historian. I work in the past, not the present or the future. But rather than let that be a cop-out, here are some ideas. One is to empower local communities to be full partners in water management, from conception to implementation to ongoing maintenance. Another is to balance centralized planning with local autonomy, to embrace the approach of what is now the sort of in vogue term integrative water resources management, or IWRM, which hasn't really addressed these problems yet, but at least fundamentally has the potential to recognize the power of local knowledge, expertise, and need. To reject the notion that African water development needs to look like it does in the West to serve users effectively. Hybrid strategies, I think, are the only real way to move forward. Large, fast-growing cities, it's just impractical to give them a modern tap water infrastructure like you have in the West. So some kind of a hybrid solution, I think, is the only real path forward there. And then lastly, to avoid the temptation to develop their way out of the crisis, which I think as a person who has worked a lot in the 20th century, there is this kind of repeating idea that we can develop our way out of problems. And I think that this is a good example where that has not been the case. Development certainly has a place, but it is not the end-all be-all of solving these problems. So this takes us back to Cape Town. I took this photo a couple of years ago, right after the water crisis. There's loads of great graffiti. The photo on the first slide was also a piece of graffiti art from Cape Town. So in the end, how did the city manage the crisis? Despite the city's tumultuous history and its deep-seated inequalities, it does show how communities can address a crisis moment. First, it took a multifaceted approach to the crisis, addressing water shortages through both supply and demand side actions. And then second, it empowered stakeholders to get involved. And I'm not going to say it was perfect, but I will say that it certainly created the idea that everybody had a place to contribute. So here's my hope, that by shedding some historical perspective on the origins of Africa's water challenges, we can find workable and equitable solutions moving into the future. That is all I have. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
So I'm going to go around with the microphone. Q&A, and we're going to ask people to use it because we do have several people listening on Zoom. We are recording the talk, so it'll capture the question. Anyone want to start us off? Yeah.
Thanks. Microphone's kind of going, I don't know. I'll try again. I came in. Like how much have they sustained efforts to conserve water and kind of thing? Aspects of dealing with the crisis, like the 5-minute showers, people would often have buckets in their shower to collect the water used in showers to reuse for other purposes. A lot of those practices have reverted. I feel like that maintaining that kind of vigilance is very difficult. And I think one of the striking things about the Cape Town crisis is that in many ways it was a middle class crisis because poor communities had not ever expected that water would be reliable, and wealthy communities could buy their way out of it, but through desalination or digging wells. It was really kind of like the middle stretch of largely sort of middle class Cape Townians who felt the crisis. They were the ones lining up for water. And I feel that community kind of reverted very quickly to previous practices. Now, there have been some permanent changes, like a lot of the landscaping was reverted to make it less dependent upon water, upon like irrigation. So there have been some permanent changes. I don't have with me figures on what the per day usage is these days, but my guess is that it rebounded back to where it probably was.
Yeah, thank you. This is really super interesting. I'm wondering thinking about this intersectionally in terms of the other challenges that are faced. Well, I'm going to think particularly about Cape Town, I guess. Was the water crisis used at all to aggravate the? So in other words, was this used as an opportunity to bring green gardens and gentrify areas that hadn't been gentrified before and revert them to drought-tolerant gardens? Was that used to market new housing, modes that, also had the effect of displacement?
One of the things that definitely happened was that this whole new water all kinds of technologies. So like Cape Town is a city where if you've ever been there, has of any place I've ever been, the greatest difference between rich and poor is striking. Wealthy areas are insanely wealthy, and poor areas are the poorest I've seen in any of my travels. People who already had privilege were able to use that privilege to make this not a crisis for them. And there were people who certainly profited off of that. For middle class people, like there was some were able to kind of develop solutions, but even there, like you certainly had a divide between the people who had very recently kind of come into middle class life versus people who had established families and a longer chain of resources to draw on, where they had simply more resources available, even though people like ostensibly were kind of living at the same level. In the township areas, which is 80% of the or I think 65% of Cape Townians live in townships. I mean, for them, like the threat didn't feel the same way, in large part because the daily practices didn't change much. Like they had already been used to lining up at public taps for water, and the city government indicated to them, partly out of fear of mass instability, that they would preserve access to those taps. So whereas the middle class Cape Townians were running the threat of having their taps shut off and getting 25 liters a day, the people who were in the townships didn't actually, they weren't being threatened with having their consumption reduced by a corresponding amount. It was partly just that the fear of the mass chaos that you would have if you told people who already are living on virtually no water that they would have even less of it. not quite sure if that really gets at the wholeness of your question there.
I really want to thank you for your talk today. And I think it's really useful to be able to think about these trends and the kind of persistence of infrastructural legacies across the continent. I have a question about land use patterns, because I found myself throughout your talk, I work in Egypt, and in thinking in Egypt in particular, there's a story here about the consolidation of agricultural land under large ownership, and I think that's probably also a case that can be made for South Africa, but not elsewhere on the continent. So I'm curious about, especially in the post-colonial period, what types of trajectories we see that are connected to agriculture and the commercialization of agriculture where that is relevant.
One of the challenges of doing a continent-wide project as a person who is trained in the East is that often my examples go straight to the East of things. So here, let me give you two historical examples. One, in the 1960s, Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere embarked on a program of socialist economic development in which he envisioned communal farming as a socialist tool for building the state. And so he envisioned a Tanzanian countryside in which people lived in villages and would work as kind of socialist units of production, except that the reality is that Tanzanians never lived in villages. They lived in disparate spread rural communities. And so in order to make that reality, they forced tens of thousands of people to move into villages. And one of the, this is an example I cut because of time, but one of the things that they promised was to provide free water in the villages to people as an idea, as a tool to lure people alongside schooling and medical care and other kind of amenities. But in the end, none of that was enough to convince people that they wanted to leave their homes to move to a new place, but eventually they were forced to do so in an effort to use agriculture to develop the Tanzanian economy to the point where industry would be able to take it over. The other example that's more recent has to do with Chinese interests. So a big part of China's interest in much of East Africa is agricultural land. So we see there had always been in East Africa a history of commercial agriculture. Fruit companies are a good example, but sisal production, which was often large-scale foreign-owned plantations. And so there was a push after decolonization to kind of divvy these things up, in particular for places that had lots of settlers to divvy settler land and up among farmers to provide land to people who had been systematically denied of it. So Zimbabwe is a really good example of that process playing out. While it happened to a certain extent, it's almost kind of reverted in the past couple of decades because of the influence of Chinese money and the Chinese buying up large amounts of land for the purpose of cultivating food to export out. And that has also placed a lot of strain on local communities. There's something similar in mining too, where they're gobbling up a lot of mining interests. But certainly that international capital is a kind of more recent kind of addition to this chapter of what happens when outsiders are placing demand on resources.
This question was about Chinese interests, and you've already answered that. But to carry forward the question Mom Kilpatrick asked about, habits that are continuing and policies that are continuing after the crisis in Cape Town, but also in the rest of Africa, as you've described it. I grew up in Bombay, now Mumbai, and we had water and electricity rationing every day, and we were part of that rising middle class, living in what's called a flat, an apartment in Bombay, and I don't think that ever stopped. My question is about the urban-rural distribution. I don't mean of water necessarily, but of how urban sprawls and water rationing or water distribution by the state or the local local authorities have changed over time, and the one part of that question is, do they have a rationing policy? And is urban sprawl, which is happening, for example, in India, where small towns became bigger towns, and now they're as big as Mumbai, and so they have to adopt certain policies. So what's happening in various parts of Africa? That's the question.
Africa is rural, but it's absolutely not the case. And we have the 13 of the 20 fastest growing cities in the world. And I put up the map of Dar because Dar has the Indian Ocean on the one side, and the way that the city has grown, this is the waterfront area, has been largely out in this direction. It has followed major trunk roads. So there's a road to the south that goes toward Mozambique, and a road over here that goes toward the west and eventually to Zambia, and then a road up there that goes north coast, and then another one that goes up toward the north. And so the urban sprawl has followed roads. It has not followed the availability of any infrastructure. And the way that this city has grown, like a lot of cities in the global south, is that informal areas become formalized. But that doesn't mean that they get resources, and water is one of the things that these areas lack. Sewerage, electricity, any number of things. And so despite the challenges of living in these cities, it is the health statistics are better in cities than they are in rural areas in much of Africa. So even if you are going into a city and you live in an informal settlement and you lack access to those resources, the rates of life expectancy are higher in urban areas. And so that along with the idea of opportunities continues to draw people despite that. I mean, what I think is quite interesting is that these cities thrive without things that we consider fundamental. And that doesn't mean that it's a good thing. It means that it is a way that people have managed to make things work. I think that the challenge is finding a way to channel that energy, but to improve it in a way in which you have people who have appropriate access to the things that they need to thrive. That hand was fast.
Wanted to get you while you still have this map up. I can't think about the number of usage for the different areas. How was that arrived at? And is it just on the basis of, like, does it come down to perceptions of hygiene and need for more landscaped space among the different racial groups that we're looking at?
South were built as segregated spaces. Tanzania is, or what was Tanzania, now Tanzania, was Tanganyika, was German East Africa. When it became British, was a UN mandate, was a League of Nations mandate territory. And that meant that they couldn't overtly segregate the city. So what they did was they did it through building codes. So in order to live in zone 1, you had to be able to build a house of certain specs. And the thinking was that only certain people would be able to afford it, and that Africans wouldn't want to live in those kinds of houses. So all kinds of stereotypes are going along with that. If you've ever been to Dar, this makes sense if you're in the city, because the zone 1 is where the nice hotels are. It's where the big compounds are. Zone 2 is the commercial district, and zone 3 is densely populated majority African neighborhoods. So partly in envisioning a cityscape this way, they envisioned European users having larger compounds, needing to water lawns, needing to take baths as opposed to other kinds of bathing. And they made all sorts of cultural assumptions about how people would use water. So like assuming that, say, Europeans would want baths, and that the Asian population, which in coastal East Africa is about 5% of the population of these cities, that they would need somewhat less than Europeans and somewhat more than Africans, and they assume that Africans would generally not bathe, or if they would use buckets. So, there's underlaying the assumptions, or a whole host of cultural assumptions about how people use a resource.
Thank you, Matt, for for this inspiring presentation. I don't have a question, it's more like a commentary. When you were talking about laws, treaties, and regulations, I was remembering about, I work with pre-colonial African history, right? And how within the era of the transatlantic slave trade, those waterways, they were really important for local African rulers. So being colonized means that they lose this control and that they had a very strong grip on those waterways before. So for instance, when the European traders or traders from the Americas that were dealing with enslaved people, they went to those ports on the coast, they had to pay tariffs to use the rivers. So to go upriver, they had to pay to the local ruler heavy tariffs. They had to pay tariffs to use the water to drink, right? And when they lose this control, then colonization happened. So be able to control not just people or land, but also, and more importantly, I learned from your presentation, the waterways meant a possibility of having a sovereignty in the continent. Thanks for that.
Definitely incorporate more, like that there is a kind of, with the Atlantic littoral coastal cities, there's this kind of flip, right? Because, I was in Benin back in March, and I went to Ouida, the historic slave trading town. And one of the things is that it's one of the towns where the sort of trading compound was not on the water. It's about a mile inland, and it was because the king wouldn't let it be put on the coast. So if you go to Ghana or Senegal, like these are all right on the water, these slave trading structures. But there it wasn't, right? So that there was a long history of being able to control that coastline that does get lost at some point.
Thanks. I was wondering if there are also inequities in water quality.
So in my travels, there's only a handful of places where tap water is drinkable. And actually, like, one of the things that I think people often don't think about when they think about tap water service is that we assume that tap water is available 24/7. There are lots of cities that have piped supplies where there is no assumption of 24-hour availability. And the consistent pressure on the system provides safeguards, right? So it's the reason why you boil your water if there's a breakage in a water main is because pressure gets lost and it provides the opportunity for something to infiltrate the network. So it's the pressure that is kind of essential. And so a lot of these systems, they don't have 24-hour pressure on the system. And they also don't necessarily, they're often very prone to breakages that go undetected. And then those are pipe systems. Like wells, there's also a whole host of other concerns about the quality of water. Like a lot of parts of the world, water quality mirrors people's ability to pay. So the very, very well, in a lot of African cities outside of South Africa and the north, wealthy people get their water trucked in. So they'll have these large plastic vessels that are usually situated on the roof, and then they'll pump the water up to the top, and then it flows through gravity into the system. But the water doesn't come from a utility, it's trucked in. That is expensive. The interesting thing is here, the urban adaptation in a city like Nairobi is similar for the very wealthy and the very poor. They both are buying from vendors. It's the group in the middle that is using a pipe system that is prone to breakages and has questionable quality. And that is, when I'm thinking about quality, it's not just like a biological agent, but also like lead. These systems are old. And a lot of times, one of the big things that happens in the 60s and 70s is that pipe systems that were built start to fail. And there's no funding to support their maintenance and revitalization. They're so concerned about expanding that they don't put money into maintenance. So that a lot of the systems don't function very well.
Thank you so much for the talk. You've made me think about water in so many different ways now. But just to add one more, I wonder if your research also covers sewage and stuff like that.
Logical next step, right? I haven't done so far. My work has only incidentally covered sewerage. But in the major cities, it becomes they realize about 10 years after the first after pipe water is brought in that they need to find a way to get rid of refuse water. Initially they kind of rely on open trench sewerage to get to usually funnel water into coastal areas. In rural communities, the pit latrine is by far the most kind of common form of sanitation. So they don't necessarily have systems to deal with to drain water away, but rather they just use open pits or long drops to handle human waste, and then they just kind of assume that the rain runoff will find its way. I don't really. Yeah, it's an area where I'm understudied on it. In the wealthier cities like in Cape Town and Johannesburg and Cairo, like they're very well developed sewage systems that also tend to be better developed in certain areas of cities than others. And likewise, a common pattern is that informal communities or ones that have recently been incorporated often have nothing, no sewerage at all. It's a last thought. The idea is that if we have to prioritize, we prioritize getting water, and then we figure out what to do with it when it's already there, which has the potential to create real problems like typhoid outbreaks and things like that.
Prerogative to ask one last question. I'm curious, given the just sweeping scope of what you're doing in this book, continent-wide, and there are obviously these real patterns, are there any real outliers? As you look for these patterns in water projects across the whole continent, are there places that you really struggle to incorporate into your schema as you think about this?
That's a good question. Let me answer that in a couple ways. So one is that historians of Africa are generally trained as regional specialists. So I was trained as an East and South person. I know the East and the South best. Those are also places that were predominantly British colonized, so I know those sources best, and I understand those legal systems better than I do other areas. So for me, one of the challenges of doing something that is by its design meant to be a broad survey of a topic is that I'm trying to be holistic about my approach to the continent when I'm weak on the French-speaking places, and the North has a history of not being incorporated fully into the scholarship of sub-Saharan Africa. So those are two kind of challenges that I've had. And what I tried to do especially with covering the Saharan countries, is to try to incorporate examples alongside to kind of bring them in as part of it. But it's also that the North part has a long history of being thought of as separate from sub-Saharan. So there's that. The Southern Africa is a challenge because its colonial history falls out of the chronology. So Cape Town is founded in 1652. The scramble starts in the 1880s. And you have a good deal of European colonialism 3 centuries in South Africa before you have it in other places. But it does mean that there's a lot of things that, it's 300 years of development I'm trying to wedge into a bigger discussion of where the patterns don't quite line up. It's funny to start this talk about Cape Town when Cape Town is itself kind of an outlier. It's book publishers things like that, right? Because it's like people have heard of Cape Town, and people may know that there was a water crisis. So it's useful to introduce other discussions, but it also is a little inconvenient because the city's 350 years older than Nairobi is. So how do I make those things line up? I think that I had mentioned to a couple of you earlier, a historian's first book is usually derived from a dissertation. It's very specific, it's focused, and it tends to be long. And so going there, and the challenge of something that is more synthetic, we are drawing a lot on the work that other people have done. The challenge of that is that is that its breadth is hard as well. I mean, depth is hard because you have to really be, don't hone in and develop a deep expertise in something. But making sure that you cover a broad area and time period without overgeneralizing to the point where your points aren't good, that's a real struggle. I will tell you what the reviewers say when they read the manuscript and see what they say.
Thank you so much for the great talk and the great Q&A. This has really been fascinating. Thanks, Matt.